whether it is independent, trust, non-self-governing, or under any other limitation of sovereignty. So human rights are universal, but we should understand what is the reality. The reality, as Mr. Rubinian quoted from former Secretary General Jagland, that human rights, protection of human rights sometimes is not a primary priority when coping with difficulties of settling unresolved conflict in the Council of Europe area. It's very important confession because conflict settlement always should be aimed at human rights protection, because conflicts are conflicts for human faith, human rights, human values. As usual, actually, here the reality differs from declarations, from wishes. Millions of peoples don't have access to human rights protection institutions, human rights monitoring bodies, international development and aid, and they are mostly people living in unresolved conflict areas, and I would say de facto states, which are not formally recognized by the international community. To understand the extent of the issue, I would stress that 17% of the cases pending before the European Court of Human Rights are coming from these de facto states. And I think that this percentage will be growing unless the situation positively changes. Modifying the truth or saying of George Orwell, I would say that it turns out that all the people are equal, but some people are less equal. Question: why are not less equal people equal to more equal people? The short answer has two parts. The first part is that it is because the lack of political will of the international community to enforce its standards everywhere. It often dwells into politics and bargaining instead of focusing on human rights. The second reason is because of the stiff opposition of some Council of Europe member states which are involved in those conflicts and which are seeking to isolate the people living in de facto states. Realizing this reality, in 2018, as said, Parliamentary Assembly adopted its 2014 resolution reaffirming the legal obligations on Council of Europe member states to fully cooperate and in good faith cooperate with the international community to ensure international human rights mechanisms access to conflict areas, unresolved conflict areas. In addition, Secretary General Jagland in 2019 proposed that in order to solve the issue, actually one of the proposals was that Commissioner for Human Rights should have free, unrestricted and full access to all unresolved conflict areas at any time and with all possible and secure means. But as you can guess, for the reasons I mentioned, it has not been a reality, has not become as a reality. Why do some member states oppose to greater transparency in unresolved conflict areas? One of the reasons or their fears is what could be somewhat understandable, is that they fear of recognition of legitimacy of the authorities and people living in those areas. But the resolution 2022-40 says clearly that access to those areas cannot be presented or don't constitute as a recognition of legitimacy there. Besides, there is a practice of engagement without recognition, and in the world it has been practiced in some unresolved conflict areas, for example in Palestine case and somewhat in Kosovo case. And I think that this fear doesn't have serious basis. That's why I think, I would guess, that the main reason not to agree to give access to these areas is not that fear, but the goal of those member states to isolate the people living in de facto states, to hinder democratic, economic and social development of those states and people living there, and also to hide the massive human rights violations exercised by those states, member states. What can move the process forward? In statutory terms, actually the Council of Europe has the right to make enough diplomatic and political pressure on member states to respect the commitments and to ensure full and free access of human rights monitoring bodies to those territories. But when the reality when the thing comes to actions, some member states, even sometimes majority of the member states, are reluctant to support to those actions and to political pressure on member states. For instance, I would say that the only obstacle for access of Commissioner for Human Rights to Nagorno-Karabakh is the opposition of Azerbaijan. And I'm sure that the opposition is because of the reasons I previously mentioned. But in this case, I think that it's more important to take into account the political will and consent of the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic authorities than the Azerbaijani authorities, because the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic is the legitimate owner and the authority, elected authority in this territory, and we control the access and security system of Nagorno-Karabakh. And Nagorno-Karabakh authorities always said that we are ready to accept all the international human rights monitoring bodies, but those bodies don't want to come because of the Azerbaijani position. But I guess it's unfair, because if they want to monitor the situation, we are ready to accept them, and we are ready to cooperate in good faith and fully with those bodies. And that's why I think that it's the time that human rights independent institutions should put human rights protection before diplomatic and political expediency. What should the international community do in de facto states? I believe that the international community should not only monitor the human rights protection situation in de facto states, but also to contribute to its continuous improvement. Monitoring without contribution, I would say that it means taking school exams without teaching. It's very important to support de facto states who are willing to cooperate to improve the human rights protection system there continuously. And I would say that monitoring and contribution in this case should be at three dimensions: local, regional, and international. Direction, local direction, is to monitor the human rights protection domestically and to understand whether the human rights protection mechanisms and institutions are in full compliance with the international standards, in this case with the Council of Europe standards, and also to monitor the human rights possible violations by the local authorities. As it does in all member states. And the second dimension is regional dimension, or the human rights violations made by member states, Council of Europe member states. In Nagorno-Karabakh case, it's Azerbaijan. There are lots of directions where the human rights of Karabakh people are either violated or restricted by Azerbaijan. The first direction I would say that is Armenophobic sentiment in Azerbaijan, or Armenophobic state policy in Azerbaijan. For decades, and especially in the recent decade, it's very strong. There is a very strong Armenophobia policy there. We have here reports on Armenophobia in Azerbaijan. You can read the details. But one of the infamous examples is Ramil Safarov case, when in 2004, Ramil Safarov, an officer of Azerbaijani army, asked an Armenian officer in Budapest at a hotel when the Armenian officer was in his sleep. And after his extradition to Azerbaijan in 2012, President Aliyev pardoned him, awarded him, and he was de facto heroized in Azerbaijan. Furthermore, the Ombudsman of Azerbaijan publicly stated that Safarov should be a bright example for all Azerbaijani youth. The second direction is threat to life and threat to security of Karabakh people. Every day, or let's say every week, the Azerbaijani officials always say that we are ready and we are going to take Karabakh by force, we are going to kill Armenians there, etc., etc. And the let's say largest example is 2016 April war, when Azerbaijan triggered a large-scale war, including tens of thousands forces, heavy artillery and rocket systems, including those which are prohibited by the international law. And I would bring some examples from April War. 90% of the people, combatant or civilians, who fell under control of the Azerbaijani forces were tortured, mutilated, or executed. There were 3 examples of beheading of the Armenian soldiers. The Azerbaijani forces entered to Talish village and killed 3 civilians, including one 92-year-old civilian. They shelled Armenian school and killed a kid there and wounded 2 kids at the school. There are lots of examples from April War, and I'm sure that the ECHR, European Court, will give proper assessment for that. The third direction is somewhat, let's say, soft human rights violations or restrictions. It includes, for example, though it's not very soft one, but the Azerbaijani leadership sometimes, often even, says that they are going to shoot down the Karabakh civilian airplanes if we operate the Stepanakert airport. Another example is blacklisting of foreigners who are visiting Karabakh. But besides blacklisting, they in some cases try to start criminal cases. Even they tried criminal cases against 3 European Parliament members, but it didn't work because Interpol didn't accept their applications because there was no legal serious basis. And another example is that Azerbaijan persecute all the, let's say, investors, companies, researchers, scientists who try to work in Karabakh. That persecution is manifested with political pressure, propaganda tools, etc. The international dimension, the third international dimension, is that the human rights of people living in de facto states are violated or restricted by the international community itself. Because of our status, political and legal status, we are sometimes deprived of many opportunities, including to take part in educational programs, to get visas for educational purposes, business purposes, healthcare purposes, etc. Another problem is that we have recognition of our civil registration documents. For example, marriage certificate, birth certificate, etc. There are lots of examples when Karabakh citizens can't identify or recognize their civil registration documents abroad in recognized countries. The Karabakh case is unique, but actually other cases of de facto states have very similar examples, whatever I described. Another question: does the isolation mean the end of life in de facto states? I would say that lack of international recognition and engagement actually should not impact on our human rights protection system. And our human rights should be equally protected everywhere in the world. Otherwise, the international organizations don't have serious right to speak about the universality of the human rights. Isolation for us means only more struggle, more efforts, and the perception that we should rely only on our potential. In Karabakh case, I would say that even in this case, we are ready to cooperate with the international community. Even more, we take responsibility before the international community, and we accepted some international treaties as a part of our legal system. For example, we unilaterally joined Universal Declaration of Human Rights, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, International Covenant on Social, Economic and Cultural Rights, European Convention of Human Rights, Geneva Conventions, and I would stress that recently I officially proposed to the government and parliament to join to the Convention on Prevention of Torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. And I'm sure that accepting this convention as a part of our legal system will increase the torture prevention mechanisms' efficiency. Moreover, our republic feels accountable to the international community, and recently we submitted our initial voluntary periodic report on implementation of ICCPR to the UN committee, and also we prepared our national review on implementation of Sustainable Development Goal of the UN. To sum up, I would say that in order to explore the situation in de facto states, in this case of Karabakh, you need to visit Karabakh. You need to see with your eyes what's going on there, how people live there, what kind of successes and failures we have, and what kind of needs we have there. And I'm sure that everyone will realize, visiting Nagorno-Karabakh, that human rights should be protected equally everywhere, whether we live in Karabakh or in Strasbourg. Thank you.